Today, I'd like to tell you a story about art, beauty, reinvention, and the delirious precision of circumstance. The German philosopher Theodor Adorno once said, "It is self-evident that nothing concerning art is self-evident." Take my friend Karl Dietrich, for example. A contemporary of Adorno, Karl was born in Germany in 1918. From an early age, Karl wanted to be a mechanical engineer. By 1938, he was doing just that for the Ford Motor Company in England. But while preparing to travel to another Ford plant in Eastern Europe, Karl learned that it's impossible to know what a life will become when it's beginning. He was stopped at the German consulate in London, his passport was revoked, and German authorities gave him a one-way ticket to Berlin. Karl Dietrich was being drafted to serve as an artillerist in the German army in World War II. Karl was young, he loved his country, he loved his heritage. What did he know about the future? By war's end, Karl had become part of Germany's last line of defense. With his back against the walls of Berlin, his family's hometown, the ensuing bombings took the lives of all the Dietrich women except for Karl's mother and destroyed all the family's belongings. As the family's only surviving male, Karl headed south with his mother to Italy. The precision gears of circumstance ground on. In 1945, 5 days before World War II's armistice, tiny Costa Rica slyly declared war on Germany and confiscated the land holdings of all German nationals. As a result, the Dietrich family's only remaining property, a Costa Rica coffee plantation that Karl's mother had inherited after her uncle's death in World War I, was gone. Now, say what you will, the 20-somethings sucked for Karl. At the age of 27, Karl Dietrich had lost his country, his job, most of his family, and all of his family's property. But Karl was resilient. He approached his life as art, in process. Over the course of the next 20 years, he cultivated an interest in coffee, traveled to the Middle East, married, developed a Buddhist nature, moved to the United States, became one of the world's leading authorities on whale behavior, and later was employed as a high-rise construction engineer. It was coffee, however, that inspired Karl. Dark as hell, strong as death, sweet as love. Coffee. After an unsuccessful attempt to reclaim his family's Costa Rica coffee plantation, Dietrich joined a group of investors and purchased another Central American finca. In 1965, Karl, his wife, and their 5 sons moved to Antigua, Guatemala, to become coffee exporters. It was then that something special, something transcendental, came into Karl's life. I call it the open-air museum. Karl took his circumstances and, in what only can be described as an artistic process, reinvented his world. In 1971, Dietrich bought a Volkswagen van, and then spent the off-season traveling north with his family through Mexico and into California, hoping to find a place to establish a coffee importing business. At a chance stop at a Corona del Mar gas station in Orange County, about 120 miles south of here, Dietrich became convinced that the OC was ripe for the coffee trade. His family relocated there and opened a shop in a rented Costa Mesa garage. There, Dietrich's relationship with his van blossomed. They became a single mythical beast, a coffee-bearing centaur. Karl reinforced the van's drivetrain and transaxle to carry a heavy load of beans. He stripped out the interior for maximum cargo space and added a bench chest with parts for repairs and air horns on the cab's roof. On the tailgate, he attached a banner fashioned out of fiberglass that read, "Vaya con Dios," go with God. While Karl's Buddhist nature inhabited the van in turn shaped his aesthetics. Its simplicity became an expression of Karl, a kind of simulacrum of the man himself. Over the next decade, 8 times each year, Carl and his van hauled 2,000 pounds, 1 ton of green coffee beans on the 1,500-mile pre-National Highway improvement dirt roads, many of them dirt roads, from the Dietrich coffee plantation through Mexico to a shop in California. Before the trendy chain coffee houses of the early 1990s, with their venti half-calf, non-fat, no-foam, double-cup lattes, Dietrich refined Orange County's Java palate and primed its psychotropic engines. Love them or not, Michael Chabon, Jacques Derrida, Gustavo Arellano, Richard Nixon, Frank Gehry, Tiger Woods, Kobe Bryant, Steve Martin, Gwen Stefani, Leo Fender, Jean Baudrillard, who I'll talk about later, and a host of other, for lack of a better word, trendsetters. All got juiced on Dietrich beans in Orange County. It was sublime. It was the beginning of Dietrich coffee. But Carl was Zen. He had no master plan. He lived in the moment. The van had transformed him. Now he saw magic and beauty all around. To Carl, the world was an open-air museum filled with works of art. Everywhere he looked, beautiful expressions of human creative skill and imagination. By 1983, Carl's son Martin joined him in his enterprise. The van sitting in front of their new store became a landmark. If you found that van, you found the best coffee in the world. Carl was not only delighted by the hard-earned results of his work, but also by the delirious precision of circumstance, chance. And like art, sometimes circumstance takes us by surprise. By the 1990s, Dietrich Coffee began an expansion plan that slowly perverted the business. As Parkinson's disease ravaged Carl, Dietrich Coffee went public. A cadre of ex-fast food executives took over management, and while Dietrich Coffee, Inc. became the second largest specialty coffee company in the United States behind Starbucks, the Dietrich family lost all control. Eventually, Carl passed away, and Martin was pushed aside. The name above the door still said Dietrich Coffee, but the quality and the magic of Carl's artistic process were gone. And the van? Well, what became of the van? Like Ken Kesey's bus, Carl's van was returned to nature, parked outside in snowy Sandpoint, Idaho, in the backyard of Carl's son, Steve, and left to the elements. Vines grew through the van's interior, rust formed on the wheels, mold on the seats, the tires rotted. Vaya con Dios. When I learned of the van's fate, in a fit of irrational exuberance, I proposed that the van be brought back to Orange County and put on display at the Newport Harbor Art Museum. Fashioned with pragmatism and love, I considered Carl's van to be an important work of local art, a shrine to an historic shift in one of the most culturally influential places in Southern California, if not America. Carl's van was a testament not only to utility, but a window into the spirit of reinvention. But there was no interest from the museum. The van, considered to be more artifact than art, was deemed unsuitable for display. It remained in Idaho to return to nature. For me, Carl's van became a lesson in the future of art, where artistic expression is headed in the 21st century. Let me explain. Again, I think of Theodor Adorno. Art is surely not self-evident. The finished product is certainly not discernible in its origin. More importantly, perhaps meaning is found in the process of art rather than in the product. We're at a point in time when nearly everyone has access to producing artistic things. But when replication, sampling, mashups, and mixdowns are thought of as art, what becomes a process? The making of art. Does it vanish into a program format, or does it flourish? In the traditional sense, art has always been about simulacra, a representation of another thing, real or imagined. The Statue of David, Guernica, Monet's Water Lilies, Rothko's White Over Red, Einstein on the Beach, Highway 61. In that regard, there's a delightful quote I'd like you to consider about representation in simulacra. It's from the notorious 20th century French philosopher Jean Baudrillard, who I mentioned earlier sipping Dietrich coffee in Orange County. Here's the quote. "The simulacrum is never what hides the truth. It is truth that hides the fact that there is none. The simulacrum is true." The quote appeared as an epigraph to one of Baudrillard's most famous works, Simulacra and Simulation. It is attributed to the book of Ecclesiastes, and ironically, it's been requoted thousands of times. But more about that in a bit. In a literary sense, the quote can be simplified in the saying, "All great stories are true, some actually happened." Baudrillard wrote like a mystic. He was a prophet of hyperreality, the modern condition that fancies simulations of reality as experience. You know, Las Vegas, sampling, sex dolls, Second Life, canned laughter. Baudrillard foresaw this separation of experience, the distance between what's real and what's hyperreal, what's Main Street in Ojai and what's Main Street at Disneyland, what's life in reality and what's life on reality TV. For centuries before, a simulacrum was defined simply as a representation of what is real. But for Baudrillard, a simulacrum was no longer just a representation. It became truth in its own right, the hyperreal. Within this hyperreality, we become so reliant on models and maps that we begin to lose contact with the real world. Our reality begins to imitate the model, which eventually precedes and determines our world. Simulacra then becomes a copy without an original, like Main Street at Disneyland. The quote, attributed to the book of Ecclesiastes, tells us that truth is ever illusory, but the symbol, the statue, the painting, the word, the van, the expression is always true. Now that's pretty heady stuff. I mean, if art or representation is that which is true, how do we incorporate that truth into our world? Notably, the most popular traditional definition of art gave us a hollow answer. It told us that art was both useless in a functional sense and yet of high value. Another popular definition held that art must be made with the intent that it is art to be considered art. It would follow then that art couldn't be made by chance, it had to be intentionally useless. Art, as an expression of its earnest futility, the word art became codified to mean fine art, art with a seal of approval. In the fine art coding system, if an object was artistic but functional, it was called craft, not art. If the object was used in a commercial or industrial way, it was called design, not art. Over time, with rapid advancements in technology and increases in leisure time, people became more accustomed to functionlessness. And by the 20th century, these lines of demarcation between art and design and craft began to blur, which brings us to Marcel Duchamp's store-bought urinal and Andy Warhol's Brillo boxes, things that certainly weren't considered art until Andy and Marcel plopped them in the gallery. Now, you really have to admire their cojones. Through their art, they express the idea that if you're going to tell us that we have to make art with intent, then why the hell can't we leave out the process and make it all intent? Such was a relationship between art and culture and seals of approval. Sadly, these seals of approval and much of our culture's relationship to art led for some to a hardening of the attitude and an overly rigid interpretation of art. Now, we all know people who suffered from hardening of the attitude, oftentimes called psychosclerosis. I have family members who are afflicted. Psychosclerosis prevents the sufferer from seeing and dreaming and imagining a range of possibilities. It's dogmatic and prejudiced and inflexible. The afflicted see art as self-evident. In accepting what we're told about what is and is not art, we discover nothing. We lose the value of art, the joy of discovery, and delight in the flight of fancy. So is art really useless? Is art really dogmatic? Or is art transcendent? I believe art's transcendent. I believe that the truth in art can be found in a place I call the open-air museum. Marshall McLuhan, the messenger of the medium, suggested that art always functions as a counter-environment, designed to make visible what is usually invisible about a society. In the creative process, lift the veil and behold, there's the art on the other side in the counter-environment. By extension, the open-air museum gives McLuhan a twist. In the open-air museum, the counter-environment is one and the same with what is real and visible. It's not a separate reality, but rather an always-present way of perceiving. It tells us that art exists within us. Art, 21st century art, is a way of working and of being, a humanized art. Such was Carl Dietrich's world. The open-air museum, which by the way happens to be the name of my latest book, requires that we are open to our senses. It recognizes beauty wherever it is found and places less value on what we're told and more on what we experience. It is sometimes chance, the delirious precision of circumstance. But above all, it is a process that allows us to live in our works. As they say on the Indonesian island of Bali, we have no art. We do everything as well as we can. Now, let's get back to Baudrillard, his quote. The simulacrum is never what hides the truth. It is truth that hides the fact that there is none. The simulacrum is true. A few years ago, I decided to dig a little bit deeper into that quote, to try and find it in the book of Ecclesiastes. It wasn't there. So I contacted biblical scholars, even searched the annotated version of the Apocrypha and the deuterocanonical books of the Bible in hopes that these might be the words of Ecclesiasticus. Still, no simulacra. Then I found the truth online on a blog. Baudrillard made the quote up. He pulled it right out of his philosophical ass. I have always used completely imaginary quotations, Baudrillard said in an obscure interview in 2003, a few years before his death, the funniest being the one from the epigraph to a chapter in Simulacra and Simulation. Nobody spotted it. Baudrillard goes on. Doubtless, it is impossible to do without references, but they have to return to secrecy. The center of gravity lies in what we do. That must be our wellspring. Today, in an era of replication, the value of art is shifting away from something inherent in the product. Instead, the value of art is refocusing. It is becoming the wellspring of imagination and process that we use to see the world differently. As our preconceptions pass away, the value of art is the ability to recognize beauty and joy all around and to delight in the symbols and expressions and doings of such awareness. Baudrillard was showing us that process, the doing, is the heart of art. The art of his expression, his quote, was showing us how we make our own rules. No matter how referential the simulacra becomes, no matter how many models are overlaid on what is real, the creative process remains to give things spirit and meaning. The center of gravity lies in what we do. That must be our wellspring, and that must be our point of delight. One more thing. In 2007, after splitting from Dietrich Coffee, the company that bears his family's name, Carl's son Martin opened Key & Coffee across the street from the original location of his father's first store. One day, as he was driving up 17th Street on his way to the traffic jam 405 freeway to pick up a shipment of raw coffee beans in Los Angeles, Martin, completely by chance, strayed off course and ended up winding through the residential streets of Costa Mesa. Approaching Newport Boulevard, something familiar caught his eye. As he drew nearer, Martin's jaw dropped in astonishment. There, sitting in a driveway, was his father's Volkswagen van. Air horns on the cab's roof. the van that had been left to return to nature, the van that had the vines growing through it. And in its window was a for sale sign. Martin now pilots Carl's van through the streets of Orange County. It's not in the Newport Harbor Art Museum. It's in the Open Air Museum. And on his tailgate is the same sign as before, Vaya con Dios. Thank you.